Hello, this is Jim Schwab. I'm manager of the Hazards Planning Center at the American Planning Association. I happen also to be an adjunct instructor at the University of Iowa School of Urban and Regional Planning. And with me is one of the students from a course last fall called Planning for Disaster Mitigation and Recovery, the course that I teach. Emily Seiple, graduating from the Masters of Urban Planning program this spring. And she is the winner of a student paper contest that was sponsored by the Hazard Mitigation and Disaster Recovery Division in cooperation with Texas A&M just this spring. And we're going to talk about your paper.
Awesome.
So let's start by talking about some of the overall impacts of Hurricane Irene. The paper was about disaster recovery in Waterbury, Vermont from Hurricane Irene, which occurred in 2011. Can you tell us a little about what happened, actually, what the consequences of that hurricane were for the state of Vermont and Waterbury in particular?
Yeah, absolutely. So the storm reached Vermont as a tropical storm at the end of August in 2011, and it caused $733 million worth of damage to infrastructure, homes, businesses, and about 1,500 people were ultimately displaced, and several were also killed during the storm. The storm left many communities isolated, either from damaging the roads or also from power outages, which is just another form of isolation. And then specifically in Waterbury, Vermont, they sustained damages of about $9 million to homes and businesses, and also tying the state's impacts to Waterbury. The state office complex was located in Waterbury, Vermont. And so the State Emergency Operations Center ended up having to evacuate for the first time and went to the FEMA's Joint Field Office in Burlington. And the state hospital had to evacuate many patients. Many of them were psychiatric patients. And just for a number of reasons, you don't want the emergency operations to be flooded when there's flooding. And I forgot to mention that it was a river flood that caused the damage in Waterbury from the Winooski River.
Yeah, this is $9 million of damages in a town of how many people?
About 5,000.
About 5,000. So that's a big impact on such a small community.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can you tell us some of the best examples that you found in your paper of effective hazard mitigation in Waterbury?
Well, just to build on some of the damages that occurred when the state complex was inundated with water, they lost a lot of their email servers, and it really complicated dispatching abilities for field staff and just generally communication across the state when you want to be able to respond to something like this. And so where critical facilities were located was really a big issue. And so that's one extreme where it really didn't go well for them. And then on the positive side, the Waterbury Fire Station had just recently been reconstructed with some flood mitigation measures, and that facility was able to become a hub for community assistance in the wake of the storm. And so that was a really good example of doing hazard mitigation well and being able to use your facilities. I think in general, a lot of the hazard mitigation projects that were proposed in the aftermath focused on structural changes rather than looking at where facilities themselves were placed. And so I think more structural elements were a part of hazard mitigation. Probably the best example I could see post the storm was the development of a citizens-led group that focused on floodplain management. And so they helped get the community engaged in the community rating system under the flood insurance program. And so I think that they'll be a really great force in helping the community put together a long-term vision.
In your paper, you said at one point that the power of water in Vermont was like a stream from a fire hose. Explain what you meant by that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if you think about a water hose, it's straight and the water comes out powerfully, as I mentioned.
Very fast, yes.
And so there were a number of environmental reports that talked about how a legacy of straightening where water goes, straightening streams, channelization, and then also adding berms directs the water really quickly. And then also that exacerbates erosion, which kind of keeps the cycle going. The more things erode, the faster the water can go. And so that causes a lot of damage to bridges, to roads, because the water is moving so fast. And that's also why homes can be swept away. And so the EPA and Vermont's Department of Natural Resources cited erosion as a huge factor of damages, even more so just than the flooding itself.
And of course, as we all know, Vermont is a mountainous state, so that
Yeah,
it accelerates the speed of the
yeah, of
erosion.
course.
Can you describe for us the role that was played in Waterbury by the Federal Emergency Management's long-term community recovery team? This is a relatively newer program from FEMA that is basically designed to assist communities like Waterbury, correct?
Yep. So the community of Waterbury voted within only 2.5 months of the storm to accept FEMA's assistance. They had a local community member who was also a state legislator that advocated for them to get the assistance from this FEMA team. There were other FEMA staff on the ground doing a number of things, but in this capacity, they had a team of about 8 people come to Waterbury and helped them put together a recovery plan that consisted of 22 different projects under 5 different themes, ranging from capacity building to hazard mitigation, and they completed the planning process in 5 months, also with a series of public meetings that really helped shape the project development.
Of course, there were some problems with that whole setup because you described the lack of a planning framework as a major weakness of the Waterbury long-term community recovery plan. Can you tell us what you meant by that?
Yeah, well, I do have to say it's hard to be critical of something that ultimately was so
Sure.
successful in some ways. The projects, or the plan was really a detailed implementation project plan. It was designed to carry these 22 projects through from beginning to end. So they had detailed timelines, project champions were assigned to each project, and so looking at it that way, it was very much a success. But in terms of policy, the plan was very light, and so there were some of the projects were to undertake studies, and so those could come up with policy recommendations. But otherwise, there was very few comprehensive recommendations in terms of floodplain management or changing land use development patterns, addressing building codes, things like that. And so maybe some more concrete examples for the community that were really relevant for Waterbury was just not being able to fully connect how these projects for recovery could intersect with community goals. So there were a few projects that looked at recreational spaces. Kind of late in the planning process, some of the town leaders wanted to add a number of parks and recreation type projects, but they didn't include recommendations for how those spaces could help with flood mitigation. And that's a really important part of hazard mitigation because you want to achieve multiple goals at the same
Sure.
time so that the community wants to support it in the long run, so that as they kind of forget about how bad the flooding was, they still want their park space and they still want to kind of have that justification for keeping development out because they have the nice recreational area. So that was one example about how those things could have been coordinated, and that was actually addressed in the community's hazard mitigation plan. It just didn't quite make it
Into
in
the
its full
recovery plan,
form
yeah.
into the recovery plan.
So at the same time, as you said, it was still a very, very successful recovery in many ways. Can you tell us what ultimately did contribute to the successful recovery in Waterbury, and what were some of the key elements of that success?
Yeah, I think one great element of the recovery plan was that a lot of funding and attention was allocated towards building capacity. So the town put funding towards hiring a recovery director, economic director, had proposed an assistant municipal planner. And so in the best case scenario, you'd have a staffing plan in place maybe beforehand for a disaster, before a disaster occurs. But when you receive so many new federal resources and an influx of donations, all these things, having people in those key places really helps the community from being overwhelmed and from mismanaging those funds. So I think that they were willing to invest in that was still a great step forward. And then kind of looking beyond those official paid positions, the volunteer effort was astounding. Their economic development group, Revitalizing Waterbury, created a nonprofit, or a subgroup. They're a nonprofit. They created a subgroup called Rebuild Waterbury that became a regional hub for case management assistance and helping get resources to people who needed it. And they raised over $1 million and logged a ton of volunteer hours and helped a lot of households in the process. So having that proactive community that wouldn't let projects fall by the wayside was a huge factor of their success. And that's why it's hard to criticize the project approach some ways, because they really did a good job running with their projects.
Okay, well, let's just close with one thing. What would you say was the biggest single thing that you learned from working on this paper?
Yeah, that's a great question. I got to speak with the recovery director and the economic director, and one thing we talked about was just that complacency can really set in the farther away a community gets from the disaster. And so having policy recommendations or restricting development kind of on your mind at the beginning when there can be that wide community support for it is really important, because as you do recover, as you see success, it's hard to want to put a stop on that to shore up the community for the long run.
Thank you, Emily, for doing this interview. Thank you to our viewers for watching this interview, and you can find out more information about this paper and access it through planning.org.